Have you ever watched a video, read a tweet, or simply seen someone doing something in real life and thought, this is why aliens don't visit us? Don't get me wrong, there have always been weird people. Every generation has its fair share of oddballs. The difference today is that social media has given them a global stage. We're exposed to them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Years ago, these people were mostly confined to the fringes of society. Their behavior was often met with ridicule and criticism, and because of that, it rarely made its way into mainstream culture. Whether that was always fair is another discussion entirely, but it did create a fairly clear line between what society considered normal and what it didn't. Today, that line has become increasingly blurred. Sometimes it's genuinely difficult to tell the difference between individuality, attention seeking, and behavior that would have once been considered completely unhinged. And that raises an interesting question. Should we really be normalizing everything? Social media didn't invent attention, but it certainly industrialized it. In the attention economy we created, going viral has become a personal mission for countless creators, sometimes even an obsession. Just look at someone like MrBeast, the biggest YouTuber on the planet. He's openly admitted that YouTube consumes nearly every aspect of his life. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with wanting to make entertaining content or build a successful career online. In fact, good for anyone who managed to do it. The problem begins when engagement becomes the only metric that matters, when views become more important than values, when you convince yourself that anything is justified as long as people are clicking. We've all heard the phrase, there's no such thing as bad publicity. It sounds clever. It also happens to be complete nonsense. History is filled with celebrities, companies, politicians, and influencers who discovered the hard way that attention alone doesn't buy trust, respect, or longevity. One of the biggest mistakes made by parts of the media, online creators, and even politicians is assuming that the general public is fundamentally gullible, that people will believe whatever they're told, that they're incapable of recognizing obvious nonsense. Maybe that's true inside certain online bubbles, but most ordinary people can still tell the difference between substance and spectacle. The internet often gives the impression that the loudest voices represent the majority. In reality, they're usually just the most visible. Algorithms don't reward what's reasonable, they reward what keeps you watching. And outrage has proven to be one of the most addictive forms of entertainment ever created. One of the biggest misconceptions about social media is that people mistake attention for admiration. Views become respect, likes become validation, comments become support, and money becomes success. But none of those things are necessarily connected. A million people can watch your video because they genuinely enjoy it, or because they're laughing at you, or because they're completely horrified by what you're doing. The algorithm doesn't care why they clicked, it only cares that they did. And that's exactly the problem. The internet rewards attention above almost everything else. The more outrageous you are, the more likely you are to go viral. The more conversational your opinion, the more people argue in the comments. The more absurd your behavior, the longer people keep watching. Outrage isn't a bug anymore, it's the business model. And what do we get in return? Half-naked influencers sexualizing the most mundane activities imaginable. Lifestyle gurus making increasingly ridiculous claims just to stand out. People filming themselves, eating themselves into an early grave. Prank channels that confuse harassment with comedy. Rage bait, shock content, brain rot, whatever keeps the engagement graph pointing upwards. Every platform says it wants meaningful conversation and high quality content, yet their algorithms often reward the exact opposite. So, can we actually fight this? Or have we reached the point where social media has fundamentally changed the way we think? Sometimes it genuinely feels like we spent the last 20 years living in a digital version of reality. One where algorithms decide what deserves our attention, and the constant flood of content slowly erases our memory of what life felt before all of this. Maybe that's overly dramatic, or maybe it isn't. What frustrates me most isn't even the content itself, it's how difficult it's become to criticize it. The moment you question certain behaviors, you're immediately labeled a hater, bigot, or phobic of something. Ironically, these accusations have become so common that they've lost much of the power they once had. People hear them now and simply roll their eyes, which is unfortunate because there are genuine cases of hatred and discrimination that deserve to be taken seriously. When those labels are thrown around carelessly, they become less effective when they're actually needed. Originally, many of these ideas were intended to protect vulnerable people from bullying and harassment, and that's a good thing. Nobody should be abused simply for existing. But somewhere along the way, in some corners of the internet, those same labels started being used less as a protection and more as a conversation stopper. Instead of debating an idea, people attack the person expressing it. Instead of answering an argument, they question your character. And once you've been assigned the wrong label, it often doesn't matter what you actually meant. Apologizing rarely helps, clarifying rarely helps, changing your mind rarely helps. In the eyes of the online mob, the verdict has already been delivered. What makes this even more frustrating is the inconsistency. Support one political figure and you're branded an extremist. Support a different controversial position and suddenly you're courageous and progressive. This isn't about defending one side or attacking the other. Personally, I think every political tribe is capable of acting completely irrationally. The real issue is intellectual honesty. Ideas should be judged on their own merits, not on who said them, which party they belong to, or whether they happen to be fashionable at the time. Because once we stop evaluating arguments and start evaluating identities, meaningful discussion becomes almost impossible. Without discussion, all we're left with is tribalism. There was a time when shame served a purpose. If you said or did something genuinely wrong, feeling ashamed wasn't necessarily a bad thing. It forced you to reflect, acknowledge the harm you'd caused, apologize, and hopefully become a better person. That's how most of us grow. Not by believing we're perfect, but by recognizing that we're not. Sometimes all it takes is a moment of honesty, a willingness to step back, look at yourself from a different perspective and admit, yeah, I could have handled that better. That's no weakness, that's maturity. The truth is, we're often terrible judges of ourselves. We all have blind spots. Sometimes it takes a friend, a family member, or even a complete stranger to point out where we're going wrong. And while that can be uncomfortable, discomfort isn't always the enemy. Some of the biggest lessons in life come from being challenged rather than constantly reassured. That said, shame is a double-edged sword. In the right context, it encourages accountability. In the wrong hands, it becomes a weapon. There's always a world of difference between someone saying what you did was wrong and a crowd of millions deciding your entire identity should be reduced to the worst mistake you've ever made. One invites reflection, the other invites fear. I still think there's value in a bit of tough love. Not the kind that humiliates people for entertainment, but the kind that reminds us life isn't always fair. There are actions that have consequences, and that taking responsibility is often the first step towards improving our situation. It's easy to blame society though, it's much harder to look in the mirror. But that's usually where real progress begins. The problem with normalizing absolutely everything is that we risk eliminating the very idea that some behaviors deserve criticism in the first place. If every decision is automatically validated, if every opinion is treated as equally reasonable, and if every action is beyond reproach, then what incentive is there to change? You don't grow if you already believe you're perfect. You just become convinced that everyone else is the problem. Now, that doesn't mean every unconventional person deserves to be shamed. Far from it. Being different isn't a flaw. Some of history's greatest thinkers, artists, and innovators were considered eccentric by the standards of their time. Progress often begins with people willing to challenge social norms. But challenging a norm isn't the same as being immune from criticism. Ideas should still be questioned, behaviors should still be examined, and people should still be free to disagree. Understanding each other is essential if we want a healthy society. Acceptance, however, isn't something we're automatically entitled to. It's something that's built through mutual respect, responsibility, and trust. Because words have consequences, so do actions, ideas, not just for us, but for the people around us. Freedom is one of the greatest values we have. But like any powerful tool, it can be abused if we start believing it comes without responsibility. And perhaps that's the balance we started to lose. Not freedom itself, but the accountability that gives it meaning. So what's the big takeaway from all this rambling? I wish I had a neat, definitive answer, but I do not. If you've watched my videos, you'll know I'll always end up saying the same thing, and that's because I genuinely believe it. This mostly comes down to common sense. If someone is living their life in a way that doesn't harm anyone else, then honestly, who cares? Dress how you want, believe what you want, express yourself however you like. As long as you're not violating someone else's rights or causing real harm, you should be free to live your life. The problem isn't freedom. The problem is pretending that freedom means freedom from criticism. Those are two completely different things. Likewise, shame isn't something that should be imposed by strangers on the internet looking for their next public execution. Real shame comes from within. It's that uncomfortable feeling you get when you realize you've crossed a line, when you recognize that your words or actions have hurt someone, when you acknowledge that you could have done better. That's healthy. That's called having a conscience. Weaponized shame, on the other hand, it's something else entirely. It's public humiliation for entertainment. It's people enjoying someone else's downfall because it makes them feel morally superior. It's outrage without compassion, justice without forgiveness. And social media has become frighteningly good at turning that into a spectator sport. Because let's be honest, people don't just enjoy being right. Sometimes they just enjoy watching other people lose. But that doesn't mean the answer is to abandon those standards. Not every opinion deserves equal credibility, not every behavior deserves to be celebrated. And not every criticism should automatically be dismissed as hatred. A healthy society needs room for disagreement. It needs people willing to challenge ideas, question trends, and occasionally say, maybe this isn't something we should be encouraging, without immediately being accused of wanting to erase someone's existence. At the same time, we should also be careful not to become the very thing we're criticizing. It's incredibly easy to point fingers. Much harder to hold ourselves to the same standards we expect from everyone else. Because if we're demanding accountability from others, we should be prepared to accept it ourselves. So, should we stop normalizing everything? I think the better question is, should everything be normalized in the first place? Personally, I don't think so. Tolerance doesn't require agreement, and respect doesn't require approval. Accepting someone's right to exist doesn't mean celebrating every choice they make, because some behaviors deserve encouragement and others deserve criticism. The difficult part is having the wisdom to know the difference. Maybe that's why common sense feels so uncommon these days. We've become so afraid of judging anything that we started treating all judgments as equally wrong. But judgment in itself isn't the problem. Bad judgment is. So perhaps the goal shouldn't be a world where nobody is ever criticized. It should be a world where criticism is honest, proportional, and aimed at helping people improve rather than simply tearing them down. Because progress has never come from pretending every idea is equally good. It comes from debating them openly, changing our minds when we're wrong, and having the humility to admit that none of us, not me, not you, not anyone online, has all the answers. And maybe, just maybe, if we manage to get back to doing that, the aliens might finally consider paying us a visit.